On a blizzard-ravaged night, a 6-year-old boy clutches a half-frozen dog buried in snow. But when the dog's eyes flicker open, they don't hold an animal's gaze. Inside them is the memory of a child who was erased. And this is only the beginning of a terrifying journey, where our humans, memories, and animals are turned into pawns of a hidden conspiracy. Hit subscribe now to follow our gripping and haunting storytelling series. The wind howled like a living thing as Ava Miller gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Snow slashed sideways across the windshield of her SUV, and the wipers squeaked in frantic protest. Visibility was near zero. The dense pine trees of Montana blurred into a wall of ghostly shadows. "Mommy, are we almost there?" a small voice piped up from the back seat. Ava glanced at the rearview mirror. Her son Eli sat bundled in his blue parka, his round face illuminated by the soft glow of his tablet. He wasn't afraid, not yet. He trusted her. "Almost, sweetheart. Just a few more miles. We're going to beat the storm, okay?" The storm, of course, had already arrived. She had planned this weekend as a quiet getaway, just the two of them. A rented cabin in the mountains, no internet, no therapy clients calling her at 3 a.m., no courtrooms, no panic attacks. Just snow-hot cocoa and the thin line of peace she'd been chasing for months. Ava was good at helping other people sort through their trauma. But lately, her own was catching up. Eli didn't understand the way the world had unraveled since his father left. He didn't need to. He had his books, his trains, and her. That had to be enough. That had to be. The SUV's tires slipped for a fraction of a second as she rounded a bend, and Ava muttered a curse under her breath, heart leaping. Her phone had lost signal an hour ago. No turning back now. When the battered wooden sign for Echo Ridge campsites finally appeared through the swirling white curtain, Ava exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They made it. The cabin was old, more a hunting lodge than a vacation home tucked beneath a canopy of snow-laden evergreens. The path leading up to it had nearly vanished beneath the storm. Ava parked, pulled up her hood, and stepped out. The cold slapped her in the face like a wall. "Stay in the car, baby," she shouted through the wind. "I'll unlock the door." But Eli was already unbuckling. "I want to help," he insisted, stubborn and fearless. Ava sighed. There was no use arguing. They trudged through the snow together, boots crunching, breath puffing out in foggy bursts. The door creaked open to a dark, ice-cold interior. She flipped the power switch. Nothing. Backup generator, maybe? She'd figure it out. "Okay," she said, turning to Eli. "Let's unload the bags, then get a fire going." That was when Eli paused. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Ava frowned. "Hear what?" He turned his head slightly like he was listening through his bones. "I think someone's crying." The hairs on Ava's arms stood up. "There's no one out here, baby. It's just the wind." But Eli wasn't convinced. He stepped off the path and began trudging toward the tree line. "Eli," she shouted, "where are you going?" He didn't answer. The snow had already buried his boot prints. Ava scrambled after him, panic building with every step. And then she saw it, a small mound in the snow. At first she thought it was just drift. But then she saw the faintest movement, twitching, breathing. "Eli, don't touch," but he was already kneeling, brushing snow away with his mittened hands. "It's a dog, Mommy." Ava's heart jumped into her throat. She dropped beside him. Now she could see it clearly, a large dog, a Malinois by the looks of it, coated in snow and ice, half buried. It wasn't dead, barely alive. Its sides rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. The fur was matted with frost. A crust of dried blood caked one paw. "Oh my God," Ava breathed. Eli looked up at her with wide eyes. "We have to help him." She hesitated. This wasn't their problem. They were already on edge, isolated, without cell service, and in the middle of a blizzard. Taking in an injured, potentially aggressive animal, reckless. But then she looked into the dog's face. Its eyes were closed, but there was something about it, something that pulled at a part of her chest she hadn't accessed in years. The part that used to believe in mercy, even when it hurt. "Okay," she said. "Help me lift him." Together they hoisted the limp creature into Ava's arms. It was heavier than she expected. Solid muscle, no collar, no tags. They carried it into the cabin and laid it on an old blanket near the dormant fireplace. "Zeke," Eli whispered. "What?" "That's his name, I think." Ava stared at her son. "You think?" Eli shrugged. "I just know." She blinked. Chalk it up to imagination. But the name fit. Zeke. While Eli gathered logs, Ava managed to get a fire going. The warmth slowly spread through the cabin, banishing the cold in patches. The dog Zeke lay still except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Ava examined him more carefully. No microchip lump, no wounds that looked fresh. But there were faint scars on the inside of his leg, medical ones, surgical. She frowned. Why would someone leave a trained dog like this out here? She murmured. Maybe he ran away. Eli offered, rubbing the dog's ears gently. Zeke stirred slightly under the boy's touch. For the first time, Ava saw his eyes flutter open, piercing amber like backlit honey. Eyes that didn't just look, they saw. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. He simply looked at her, then at Eli, then closed his eyes again, as though that decision of who he was with had been made. The storm intensified outside. Trees bent in the wind. The world vanished into white. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly and Zeke's breathing grew steadier. They slept in shifts that night. Ava curled in a chair, Eli beside the dog. Every time she stirred, Zeke was there watching. Not alert like a frightened animal, alert like a soldier. By morning, the cabin was cocooned in a world of silence. No wind, no birds, only snow as far as the eye could see. Zeke just stood up on legs that shouldn't have held weight yet. He walked carefully, inspecting the cabin with precision. Sniffed the door, paused at the generator closet, and pawed it. Ava stared. That can't be coincidence. Eli giggled. He wants us to fix the power. She opened the closet. Sure enough, the generator had tripped. She reset it. The lights came on. Zeke sat. Eli whooped. He's smart. Too smart. Ava couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. There was an intelligence behind Zeke's eyes that wasn't entirely dog, but she told herself it was exhaustion. That she was projecting. After all, she was the one who trained in trauma psychology, not science fiction. Still, as the day wore on, Zeke never barked, never begged for food. He watched the door, the windows, like he was waiting, or remembering. When Ava stepped into the bathroom, she returned to find Zeke standing perfectly still in front of Eli, tail low, ears tilted. Eli was speaking to him, quietly, slowly, like he understood. What are you two talking about? She asked. Eli looked up. He's sad. Ava blinked. Sad. He misses someone, a boy, like me. Something cold slid down her spine. Did you dream that? Eli shook his head. He told me. Ava looked at Zeke again. He didn't move, didn't blink, but something in his gaze chilled her. There was sorrow there, and memory. That night she dreamed of a child crying in a white room, of cold hands, of something being taken. When she woke, Zeke was at the foot of her bed, staring at her. Silent. Still. A guardian, or maybe a witness. Either way, Ava knew this Zeke wasn't just a stray, and they hadn't found him by accident. They'd been chosen. The next morning brought a deceptive sense of peace. Ava stirred on the couch just as the early Montana light seeped in through the frost-laced windows. The cabin had grown warmer overnight, the fire reduced to glowing embers, but it was quiet. Too quiet. She sat up, eyes adjusting, and immediately noticed two things. First, Eli was not in his sleeping bag. Second, Zeke was nowhere in sight. Her heart stuttered. Eli, she called, rising to her feet. Bare toes instantly chilled by the floorboards. Baby. No answer. She hurried down the narrow hallway, panic beginning to thread her breath. The bathroom door stood open. The kitchen was empty. Her pace quickened until quickened. She found him. Eli was crouched by the front door, fully dressed in his parka boots on mittens in his lap. He wasn't trying to sneak out. He was staring at something. Zeke. The dog stood at the front door, still and silent, his head cocked. The lock was undone. Ava swore she'd latched it last night, had heard the click herself. The handle had been rotated halfway. She stared at the dog's paw hovering just inches from it. Eli, did you open the door? He shook his head slowly. Zeke did. Ava blinked. What? I saw him. He stood up on his back legs and twisted the handle. Like a person. Zeke turned to look at her then. Not sheepish, not guilty, simply aware. As if being caught wasn't a problem. As if it had been a test and she had passed. Ava swallowed. That's not possible. Eli gave her a small shrug, the kind kids give when they know something unbelievable just happened and are waiting for the adults to catch up. Maybe he used to live with someone who taught him. Eli offered almost helpfully. Like police dogs, or soldiers. Ava walked slowly toward the door, closed it, and locked it with a sharp click. Zeke made no move to stop her. He simply sat down in front of the fireplace, as though the whole thing had been unimportant, but Ava felt it. The first crack in the illusion. This wasn't normal. None of this was. Later that morning, she tried not to think about it as they made breakfast. Zeke remained in the corner watching, always watching. He didn't beg for food. He didn't chase his tail or roll on the rug like a typical dog might. He simply observed. When Ava dropped a fork by accident, it clattered to the floor. Zeke didn't flinch. But his ears flicked in that direction a full half-second before the metal hit the wood, as if he'd anticipated the sound. Okay, she muttered to herself. You're just hypersensitive, that's all. But deep down, she didn't believe it. That night, after another round of cocoa and storytelling by the fireplace, she tucked Eli into bed. The boy yawned and rolled onto his side, already fading. "Good night, Mommy." "Good night, sweetheart. I love you. I love you more." She smiled, kissed his forehead, and stepped out, pulling the door half closed behind her. She didn't notice Zeke slip into the room after her. Sometime past midnight, Ava was awakened by a sound. Not thunder, not the wind. A low, keening whimper. She sat up disoriented, trying to locate the source. Her ears strained against the quiet. Another sound, this time unmistakable, a soft, childlike gasp. She was on her feet, instantly hurrying down the hallway, heart beating faster with each step. Eli's door creaked open under her touch. The room was bathed in shadows. Moonlight filtered through the frost-rimmed window, casting silver patterns across the floor. Eli was writhing in his sleep, face twisted in pain. "No, no, don't, please." He thrashed against his blanket arms, reaching towards something that wasn't there. Ava rushed to him, but froze in the doorway. Because Zeke was already there. The dog stood at Eli's bedside, perfectly still, his face inches from the boy's, and he was staring directly into his eyes. Eli moaned again. "Please let me go!" Zeke let out a soft, almost human whimper. His ears were back, his tail low, not from fear, but from sorrow. Ava stepped into the room. "Zeke." The dog looked up at her slowly. The look he gave wasn't guilty. It was pleading. She hurried to the bed and cradled Eli's shoulders. "Wake up, baby. It's just a dream. I've got you." Eli jerked awake with a startled cry. "Aiden." The name burst from his lips like a scream. Ava blinked. "What?" Eli sat up, panting, clutching her sleeve. "They won't let him out. They keep putting wires in his head, and he can't feel his hands anymore. He wants to come home." She held him tightly. "It's just a dream, honey." But he shook his head, trembling. "It wasn't my dream. It was his." Ava felt the blood drain from her face. Zeke sat beside the bed, now breathing evenly. But his eyes were fixed on Eli. "I saw everything," Eli whispered, "like a video. But inside my brain." Ava smoothed his hair. "Tell me what you saw." Eli hesitated, then began to speak in a slow, haunting tone. "There's a white room, no windows, just lights in the ceiling. He's on a metal bed, and there are tubes in his arms. He's scared all the time. They shock him when he cries. They said he has to forget." Ava asked gently, barely breathing. "Men in masks, with badges, but not police. And one woman, she told him he'd never leave." Ava exchanged a glance with Zeke. The dog hadn't moved, but something in his posture had changed. He was listening. "Where did you hear this name?" she asked Eli. "What name?" "Aiden." Eli looked confused. "I didn't. He told me." "Who's he?" "The boy. The one inside Zeke." The silence that followed was absolute. Ava stared at her son. Eli stared at the dog. And Zeke, for his part, let out a long, shuddering exhale and lowered his head to the floor. Ava stood slowly and walked to the hallway. Her heart was pounding. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe Eli had heard the name on TV or a book. But they hadn't had TV. Or signal. Or stories about a boy named Aiden. Just the snow, the cold, the cabin, and this dog. She returned to Eli's room 10 minutes later, after making herself a weak cup of tea and failing to drink any of it. Eli was asleep again. Zeke was still there. But this time the dog looked up at her, not with curiosity, with recognition, like he knew what was coming. Ava crouched beside him, lowering her voice. "What are you?" she whispered. Zeke tilted his head. She reached out and touched his fur. It was warm, alive, solid. Real. But the eyes. They didn't belong to an animal anymore. She got up, walked back to her bed, and tried to tell herself she was being paranoid. That trauma had a funny way of rewriting your logic. That grief could make you see things that weren't there. But when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the white room too, and the boy who screamed into the dark. The scratching came first, soft, rhythmic, like pencil on paper. Ava opened her eyes to dim gray light filtering through the window. Snow still fell outside in a quiet hush. The cabin blanketed in a silence that felt almost sacred. The storm had not lifted. It had only deepened. She sat up listening. Scratch, pause, scratch again. It was coming from the kitchen. She grabbed her sweater, slid into slippers, and padded quietly down the hall. The fire had died down to a few glowing coals, casting long shadows across the room. She peered around the corner. Eli sat at the kitchen table in his pajamas, a mug of untouched cocoa beside him. His brow's furrowed tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth, in deep concentration as he moved a black pencil across a sheet of printer paper. Ava frowned. "Sweetheart, what are you doing up so early?" Eli didn't look up. "I had to get it out before it faded." "Get what out?" He held up the paper wordlessly. Ava took a step forward and stopped. The drawing was intricate, shockingly detailed. Pencil lines captured what appeared to be a sterile corridor, stainless steel walls, grated flooring, and rectangular panels along the ceiling that looked like fluorescent lights. In the center, a gurney. Beside it, a bank of monitors. Wires. Tubes. There was a number stenciled on the back wall, B307. Ava's skin prickled. "Where did you see this?" she asked. "In my dream," Eli replied, finally looking up. "Zeke showed me." Ava swallowed hard. "Are you saying Zeke was in your dream?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. I don't think it was mine at all. It felt like I was inside someone else's memory." Ava sat across from him slowly. "It felt real, Mommy." The lights buzzed like this. He made a humming sound, and it smelled like metal and soap and fear. He didn't say it like a kid making things up. He said it like someone remembering trauma. Her therapist instinct kicked in, watching his eyes, his hands the pause before certain words. Something was wrong, something deep. Ava reached for her laptop and pulled it open. No signal. But the cached browser still worked. She typed in keywords one after another: underground lab, Montana. Missing child experimental facility, B307. Nothing. Dead ends. Until she added Montana Child Disappearance Medical Center 10 years ago. One result. A local news archive from 2014. Grainy photos barely indexed. She clicked it. The headline read, 10-year-old boy. Missing from mountain clinic. Parents left with no answers. The article was short speculative. A boy named Aiden Sutter had vanished from a specialized neurological clinic located in a remote part of Montana. He had been part of an experimental memory therapy program due to PTSD symptoms from a traumatic accident. The facility claimed he'd wandered off into the snow during a power outage. No trace was ever found. But the story didn't end there. 3 months after Aiden's disappearance, the entire clinic burned to the ground in what was ruled an electrical fire. No charges? No follow-up? Mommy, Eli whispered, staring at the screen. "That's him." Ava looked at her son. He wasn't confused. He wasn't afraid. He knew. "It's the boy from my dream." The article had one photo. Aiden, 10 years old. Pale skin, dark eyes, crooked front tooth, smiling like someone who hadn't yet learned the world could hurt him. Ava stared at the picture, breath caught in her throat. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Eli nodded. "He was strapped to the bed in the room I saw." A rustle behind them made her turn. Zeke stood in the hallway, eyes locked on the screen. Slowly, deliberately, the dog stepped forward. The hair along his back stood on end. He approached the table and then, without hesitation, leaned forward and licked the laptop screen, right over Aiden's face. The room went still. Ava didn't move, didn't breathe. Zeke sat back and let out a low, quiet whine. "Why would he do that?" she murmured. "He knows him," Eli said softly. "I think he was him." She blinked. I think that boy is still inside him somehow. Not just memories. Like, part of him lives in Zeke now. Ava couldn't speak. She wanted to reject it, to explain it away. But the truth was already sinking in. This dog, this stray, this creature they pulled from the snow, it wasn't just unusual. It was unnatural. Zeke padded away, silent, vanishing back into the dark hallway. But his presence lingered in the air like static before a lightning strike. Ava turned the laptop toward herself again. Scanned the article. Her pulse spiked when she saw the location. Echo Ridge Neurotherapeutic Research Center. Echo Ridge. The same name as the campsite she'd found on a random travel site 2 weeks ago. The same place she'd brought Eli. No signal. No neighbors. No accident. She wasn't here by chance. She was led here. She stood abruptly and moved to the fireplace. An old trunk rested against the far wall. She hadn't bothered to open it when they arrived, assumed it was filled with firewood or dusty blankets. She threw the lid open. Inside, paper. Stacks of yellowed documents, half-burned records, damp folders warped by time. She reached in, pulling out one at random. A logo. Echo Ridge Institute for Advanced Neurology. She flipped it open. Patient intake logs, handwritten. There it was. Aiden Sutter. Intake date, March 3rd, 2014. Status Phase 3 candidate. No discharge date, no release form. She dug deeper. More files, charts, brain scans, some labeled Subject Z1, others canine host trials. Her hands trembled. They hadn't just experimented on children. They'd transferred them. Eli crouched beside her, eyes wide. "Mommy, I think this is where Zeke came from." A knock sounded. Both of them froze. Not a loud bang, just a soft tap. 3 times. Then silence. Ava crept to the window. Lifted the curtain an inch. No one. She opened the door an inch hard in her throat. Nothing but snow. But on the porch, half buried by the wind, lay a folded piece of newspaper. The edges were torn, soaked through brittle. She picked it up and brought it inside. It was an older version of the article she'd just read. More grainy photos. This one had a second image, a surveillance still. Aiden walking into the clinic, hand in hand with a man in a lab coat. Behind them, a large dog. Malinois breed. Leashed. Calm. Ava stared at the photo. It wasn't just any dog. It was Zeke, 10 years ago. And he hadn't aged a day. She felt like the floor beneath her shifted. Her stomach dropped breath shallow. "What does it mean?" Eli asked. Ava shook her head, whispering, "I don't know yet." But part of her did. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a chain reaction that started a decade ago. And now, somehow, it had found them. Or rather, Zeke had. Mommy Eli said, eyes narrowing at the photo. "That's not a leash." "What?" He pointed. "Look, it's wires." They connected him to the boy. Ava leaned in. He was right. The leash wasn't leather. It was a cluster of thick black cables running from the child's temple into the back of the dog's neck. She nearly dropped the paper. A chill spread through her bones, slower than fear, deeper than logic. This wasn't just memory transfer. This was something else. A merger. Zeke had become the vessel. And the boy, Aiden, his consciousness, his emotions, maybe even his soul, had found a new host. "Why would anyone do this?" Ava asked aloud. Eli didn't answer. Zeke returned from his hallway, walked past them both, and sat beside the fireplace. He stared into the embers, unmoving. Ava stared at him for a long time. And suddenly she felt it, not fear, not yet, but inevitability. They were no longer a mother and son on a snowy vacation. They were witnesses. And whatever Zeke carried inside him, it wasn't just a memory. It was a warning. It started with a whisper. Not words, not language, but something deeper. Like a feeling pressed into the back of a thought. A quiet flicker behind Eli's eyelids when he wasn't even trying to sleep. It began the morning after the drawing. After the photograph. After Zeke had licked Aiden's face on the screen. Eli had sat quietly for over an hour in the corner of the cabin. Zeke curled at his feet, unmoving. Ava thought he was reading. She'd handed him a picture book and gone back to sorting through the strange files she'd found in the trunk. But Eli hadn't turned a single page. He was staring. Into nothing, or maybe into something. Zeke's body twitched every few minutes. Tiny muscle pulses near the ear, or a ripple through his shoulders, almost like he was dreaming. Then Eli spoke without looking up. "Mommy." Ava turned. "Yeah, I think Zeke is trying to talk to me." She slowly set down the paper in her hands. "What do you mean?" Eli finally looked up. "It's not like talking. It's pictures and feelings. Like when you know something but you didn't hear it or see it. You just have it." Ava's stomach tightened. "What kind of pictures?" Eli hesitated. "A room, again. But now it's blurry, like a bad video. There's a boy lying down. I think it's Aiden. But there's no sound. Just this loud feeling, like being trapped." Zeke didn't react to the conversation. But his breathing deepened slightly. Ava crouched next to Eli. "And what else?" "I saw trees and wires. He wants to show me something." Ava felt the air in the room shift. "Where?" she asked. Eli pointed at the door, out there. Snow still fell lightly outside. The storm had calmed, but not passed. The woods beyond the cabin were quiet, blanketed in white. But Ava hesitated. She wasn't ready to follow her son into the trees based on a dream. But Zeke stood. No command, no prompting. He simply got up, walked to the door, and stared at the handle. "Waiting. You want to go out?" Ava asked. Zeke didn't move. Eli walked over and opened the door for him. Zeke stepped onto the porch, looked back at Eli, then started walking. "Should we follow him?" Eli asked, pulling on his jacket. Ava paused for a long second, then nodded. "Yes, but stay close." They hiked through knee-deep snow, the path winding between pine trees, heavy with ice. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Zeke led with eerie precision, weaving through trees with the ease of someone retracing old steps. "How does he know where he's going?" Ava whispered. Eli didn't answer. His eyes were wide, but he wasn't afraid. It was like he belonged here. Like something inside him recognized the rhythm of Zeke's movement. They reached a clearing about 50 yards from the cabin, a spot Ava hadn't noticed before. There, jutting from the side of a tree, was a metal plate. It looked almost like bark, camouflaged perfectly. But up close, she could see it was unnatural. Wires ran into the trunk like veins. "What the hell?" Ava murmured. Zeke stopped in front of the tree and pawed gently at the base. Ava crouched and reached forward, brushing snow aside. Her fingers touched cold steel. She dug further, revealing a small sealed box embedded into the trunk. A tiny, blinking red light pulsed like a heartbeat. Eli leaned close. "That's the thing I saw." "What thing?" "In my dream." Ava tugged at the edges of the box. It resisted, then popped loose with a hiss of air. Inside a hard drive. Standard military casing. Scratched. Scorched along one edge. Someone had hidden this. She turned it over. There was a marking CR Phase 2. Zeke sat tail still watching her, waiting again. Back in the cabin, Ava connected the drive to her laptop using an old adapter she hadn't used in years. The power light blinked once, then steady green. A folder opened automatically, inside a single video file, titled simply Zeke Origin A2 Cam 2P. Her hands trembled as she clicked. The screen flickered. And then, a room, white walls, no windows. A table in the center, stainless steel, spotless. On the table, Zeke, but not the Zeke she knew. This version of him was younger, leaner, eyes wilder. His fur was shaved in patches, and dozens of wires protruded from the back of his skull, inserted into small black ports embedded beneath the skin. Technicians in lab coats moved around him. One held a tablet, another adjusted a dial on a large machine that hummed with low, ominous energy. The timestamp read April 22, 2014. A man stepped into frame, a figure with a cold, clinical presence. He approached Zeke and placed his hand on the dog's head. Zeke didn't flinch, didn't resist. The man spoke, but there was no sound. The file had been muted or never recorded with audio at all. But Ava could read the expression in the man's face. Testing. Approval. Control. Another screen in the background showed a child's brain scan. Multiple overlays. One of them labeled Subject Aiden SO6, and beneath it, Neural Sync Rate 89.7%. The text nodded. A machine activated. Electrodes glowed. Zeke's eyes rolled back. His body spasmed, and then he stilled. On a monitor beside him, Aiden's image appeared again. Eyes closed, mouth open in a silent scream. Then black screen. End of file. Ava sat frozen. She couldn't breathe. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, unable to move. Ely beside her whispered, "They did it. They put him in." Ava turned to him, stricken. "Put who in?" "Aiden." He pointed to Zeke, who now sat by the door again, facing outward on guard. "He's not all gone. He's still there. But some of him is inside Zeke." Ava swallowed. "But why?" Eli frowned. "I think they wanted to hide him. Or maybe trap him. I don't know. But it wasn't just to save him. They did something bad." Ava stared at the screen again. The machine. The scans. The dog convulsing. This wasn't therapy. This was conversion. "Zeke wasn't rescued," she whispered. "He escaped." The implications sank in like lead. She closed the laptop. Zeke stood and walked over to Eli. They looked at each other for a long moment. No movement. No words. Then Eli nodded like he'd heard something only he could hear. "He wants us to go back," the boy said. "To where it started." Ava blinked. "The facility?" Eli turned toward her, eyes darker than she remembered. "He says there are others." A silence fell. Zeke walked to the window, placed his front paws on the sill, and stared out at the snow-covered horizon. Still watching, still waiting, and Ava knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The message came at 11:42 p.m. Ava was sitting at the cabin table, Eli asleep in the bedroom behind her, the laptop still warm from hours of digging. Snow pressed hard against the windows, thick and relentless. The fire hissed quietly in the hearth. Zeke was curled in the corner, but his ears twitched every few minutes like he knew something was coming. She almost didn't see the message. It wasn't an email, no pop-up. Just a quiet vibration from her phone, a text from a number with no name. No history. She opened it. "Return the specimen. We know where you are." Her body went cold. She stared at the words, unblinking, as if they might rearrange themselves into something more innocent. They didn't. "Return the specimen. Not dog, not Zeke. Specimen." She read the sentence again and again. Zeke's ears perked. His head lifted slowly, as if he had heard it too. She backed away from the phone. Her hands trembled as she opened her laptop, rechecked the signal. Still none. The drive offline. How had the message even come through? Then a second buzz. A photo. Blurry, low-res, but unmistakable. It was the cabin. Her cabin. Now. Taken from outside. Through the trees. The image was angled like it had been captured from a trail camera. Ava's eyes scanned the windows. Nothing. She stood, phone still in her hand, and reached for the curtains. Zeke was up now. Body rigid, his fur bristling like a static field had passed through the room. "Zeke," she whispered. He didn't move. Then he turned to the door and howled. Not a bark, not a warning. A long, high, mournful howl that echoed through the walls like a siren. Ava spun around. The front lock still latched. Zeke ran to the hallway and began to scratch violently at Eli's door. The howl had woken him. The boy opened the door groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Mom." "No time, sweetheart. We need to move." Ava shoved the phone into her back pocket, grabbed their go-bag, half-packed since the day they arrived, and sprinted to the fireplace where she'd stashed the backup keys. Another sound. Thud. From the roof. Zeke growled low and primal. "What is it?" Eli asked, scared now. Zeke pushed the boy behind Ava, placing himself between them and the front door. Then the windows went black. Covered. Something or someone had moved in front of them. And then, glass shattered. A side window imploded in a burst of snow and glass shards. Ava screamed and threw herself over Eli. Zeke launched toward the sound like a missile, barking, now no longer silent. Ava saw movement, a shape in black sliding through the opening. "Move," she screamed. They bolted for the back exit. Zeke stayed behind, intercepting the intruder with a crash. Ava threw the rear door open. Snow spilled inside, knee-high and biting cold. They ran, no coats, no plan, just instinct. The trees swallowed them quickly. Moonlight sliced through the canopy in thin beams. Ava gripped Eli's hand tightly, dragging him through drifts, her lungs burning with cold. Behind them, she heard Zeke bark a sound of pure fury, and then another crash, then silence. She hesitated, turned. "Zeke," but Eli tugged her hand. "He's coming. He told me." "What?" "He said run now." They pushed deeper into the woods. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 15. Time warped under fear. Then a rustle, a blur. Zeke appeared beside them, flanking from the side. He wasn't limping, not bleeding. But his eyes had changed. Hardened, focused. Ava had never seen a dog look like that before. "Where do we go?" She gasped, heart thudding. Zeke turned, cut through a snowbank, and led. Not blindly, with purpose. They followed him, weaving through the trees until they reached the old forest access road Ava had noticed on day one. Long overgrown, covered in snow, but still drivable if it came to that. She stopped long enough to dig out the keys from her pocket and hit the unlock button on the rental 4x4, parked a few hundred yards down the path. Lights blinked through the dark. Eli slid into the back seat. Zeke jumped in beside him. Ava jumped behind the wheel, breathless. And then movement in the mirror. A black figure emerging at the tree line, holding what looked like a tranquilizer rifle. No face visible. Ava floored the gas. The tires spun once, then gripped. The SUV surged forward just as a dart whipped through the air and slammed into the rear glass with a sharp thud. "Go!" Eli shouted from the back. "I am." The forest blurred past them. Trees whipping by. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the endless white. Zeke never looked away from the rear window. They didn't stop for 20 minutes. Not until the forest gave way to a narrow mountain road, and the signal bars on her phone flickered back to life. 3 bars, then 4. Ava pulled over, hands still trembling. Her phone buzzed again, this time a new number. She opened it, expecting more threats. Instead, a single line of text. "You don't know what you're carrying." She dropped the phone like it had burned her. Eli leaned forward between the seats. "What do they want?" "I don't know." Zeke let out a low growl. Eli looked at Ava. "He says they want what's inside him." Ava stared at her son. "What is inside him?" "I don't know. Not everything. Just pieces. But they're waking up." "Waking up," Eli nodded. Zeke let out a breath and pressed his head against the boy's leg. Ava finally pulled away from the shoulder, glancing at the road ahead. They were pointed south. There was no plan, no destination, only one truth. They were being hunted. And the specimen, the dog they saved from the snow, wasn't just evidence. He was a weapon, or maybe a key. Ava's fingers clenched around the wheel. Whatever they wanted, they couldn't have him. And they couldn't have her son. The town was barely a town. Just 3 aging buildings, a gas station, a diner with a flickering open sign, and a hardware store that hadn't seen new stock in years. Ava pulled the SUV beside the only gas pump, her hands still white-knuckled from hours of silent driving through snow-blanketed back roads. Zeke sat alert in the back seat. Eli, tucked under a blanket, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion, perked up as Ava stepped out to fill the tank. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that meant nobody watched the news here, or if they did, they didn't care. A bell above the station door jingled as a man walked out. He didn't look at them, just lit a cigarette with shaking hands and stared at the white horizon like it had betrayed him. Zeke growled low. "Easy," Ava whispered, watching the man disappear behind the station. That's when it happened. From around the side of the building, a sound, a bark sharp and high. Another dog emerged. Larger than Zeke, all black fur and lean muscle. Its eyes locked onto the SUV. Zeke rose instantly, body tense but not aggressive. He stared through the glass. Then he barked. Not a warning, not fear. It was rhythmic, precise. One short, too long. The other dog responded in kind. Ava froze at the pump. Eli sat bolt upright. "They're talking," he said. "What?" "I don't know how I know. But they are." Zeke remembers him. The 2 dogs continued their strange staccato exchange, almost like code. Back and forth, no movement, no circling, no sniffing, just sound and stillness. Ava shut the pump off. The black dog stepped forward once, then stopped. Zeke barked again, faster now. Then suddenly the black dog turned and sprinted back behind the station. Gone. Zeke let out a whimper. Not frustrated. "Morning," Eli spoke softly. "They used to know each other." Ava turned to him slowly. "How would you know that?" "He told me." She climbed into the driver's seat. "You're saying Zeke remembers?" Eli didn't blink. "Pieces. Not all at once. But that dog was from before. From when he lived in the White Room. The place with wires. The idea hit her again like a weight. Zeke wasn't just a dog. He was a container. A living storage unit holding fragments of something that shouldn't have survived. What kind of memories, she asked, starting the car. Eli shrugged. Not normal dog things, people things. Fear, voices, numbers. Numbers? Yeah. Like sequences, codes. He doesn't understand them, but he feels them. Zeke lay back down, eyes heavy now. Tired. Like remembering took effort. Ava gripped the steering wheel. Her mind raced. If Zeke was remembering, and if those memories were somehow being shared with Eli, then they needed help. Not police. Not animal control. Someone who understood what had been done to this creature. She opened her phone, searched her encrypted notes from the files she downloaded back at the cabin. A name had come up once in the metadata of the corrupted video Dr. Jonas Grant, neurological biologist, formerly DARPA affiliated. She remembered that much. She dug deeper. Back channel articles. A defunct blog from 10 years ago, now archived. It described a whistleblower who had vanished shortly after leaving a classified project under mysterious circumstances. The blog mentioned a facility in Montana Echo Ridge and linked Dr. Grant to its neural mapping initiative. Then a line from the comments. If anyone knows where Grant went, it's that reclusive vet out near Twin Lakes. Still fixes broken dogs, they say. It was thin, a rumor buried in a decade-old thread. But it was something. She hit the road again, heading south. The snow thickened around them like fog. Mile after mile passed in silence, broken only by Eli humming softly, and Zeke occasionally shifting in the back seat. The world outside felt sealed away, dreamlike. 2 hours later, the Twin Lakes sign appeared. A worn road curved toward a frozen lake past derelict cabins and boarded-up boat rentals. The GPS was useless, so she followed the only road still plowed barely. A mailbox appeared on the right, crooked and rusted. J. Grant, no trespassing. Ava turned in. The house was small, remote, built from stone and cedar barely visible beneath snow-draped pines. A wind chime clanged like distant warnings. A pickup sat under a tarp out front. As she stepped out, Zeke stiffened. Eli grabbed her arm. He knows this place. She knocked once. No answer. Twice. A shuffle behind the door. Then a voice, old and sharp. Go away. I've got nothing worth stealing. Ava stepped closer. We're not here to steal. We're here because of Zeke. Silence. Then, what did you say? I said we have the dog. The lock clicked. The door opened 2 inches. A man in his 60s peered out. Beard unkempt. Eyes sunken. He stared at Zeke first, then at Eli, then back at Ava. You brought it here, he said. Please, she whispered. We need help. He opened the door all the way. Inside the house smelled like dust and coffee and burnt wire. Books stacked in towers. Old computers humming in corners. Grant sat across from them, hands folded, gaze locked on Zeke. How long has he been awake? He asked. 2 weeks. And he found you. We found him. Grant snorted. No such thing. Eli sat on the couch, stroking Zeke's ears. Your name came up, Ava said. In a file. Echo Ridge. Grant stiffened. You're lucky they didn't track you here. They tried. He muttered, of course they did. Ava leaned forward. What is he? Grant looked at Zeke. Not a dog, he said flatly. Not anymore. Not since they began the transfer protocol. Phase 3. Transfer. Grant went to a cabinet and pulled out a dusty binder. Echo Ridge was never about therapy. It was about migration. Uploading select consciousness fragments into alternative vessels. Testbed for adaptive memory storage. Bio-integrated recall. Ava's mind spun. You mean he's carrying a memory profile? Likely several. Not just data. Emotional sensory reactive memory. We mapped entire trauma signatures into canine hosts. And Eli can feel them, Grant eyed the boy. He's resonating. That's rare. Means his neural frequency is compatible. The dog's broadcasting. Your son's receiving? Ava blinked, like telepathy. Closer to sympathetic resonance. But yes, you could call it that. Grant sat again. There were 3 dogs in Phase 3. Only one escaped. Him. He pointed at Zeke. And the others? Still in containment, Grant said. Unless... He trailed off. Ava said nothing. Zeke lay still, but his ears twitched again. He remembered. The kettle let out a long, aching whistle steam, curling into the dim cabin air. Dr. Jonas Grant poured 2 mugs of tea with hands far too steady for a man harboring ghosts. Ava watched him across the table, her fingers white around the ceramic, her breath shallow. Eli sat curled on the floor beside Zeke. Both of them quiet, bonded in a silence deeper than words. Jonas finally sat. The light above them buzzed. Ava broke first. You said he's not a dog anymore. No, Jonas said flatly. He's not. He reached for a folder beside him. Old weathered, the tab faded almost to nothing. He opened it like a wound he'd been stitching shut for years. Project name was EchoMind. Division of Applied Neuromemory Research under DARPA's biocomputing arm. You won't find it on paper anymore. Everything was burned, buried, or silenced. He slid a photo across the table. Zeke, but younger, leaner, hair shaved in stripes to reveal a surgical grid across his skull. Ports like metallic sores ran along his spine. Ava flinched. We began EchoMind with one question. Jonas continued. Can human memory, conscious memory, be transferred into a living host without total cognitive overwrite? Not just data, not numbers or facts, but experience, smell, emotion, instinct. He looked at Zeke. We weren't looking for replication. We were looking for preservation. A memory that could adapt, hide, survive after death. Ava whispered. Why use dogs? Because they're neurologically compatible. High empathy thresholds, pattern-based recall, and above all, loyalty. If you want to safeguard memory, you don't put it in a server you can hack. You put it in something alive, something that wants to protect. His hand trembled slightly now. We succeeded. God help us, we did. He pointed to Zeke. He was the first stable vessel. And Aiden, Ava asked. That name Aiden hung in the air like smoke. Jonas shut his eyes. Subject Aiden Stroud. 10 years old. Exceptionally high neuroplasticity. Trauma survivor. Ideal candidate for Phase 3 mapping. Eli looked up slowly. He didn't survive, he said quietly. Jonas opened his eyes, stunned. How do you know that? He told me. Jonas stared at the boy. Then turned to Ava. The project changed after Aiden. The mission wasn't just preservation anymore. It shifted. They wanted active applications. Surveillance, behavioral tracking, emotional imprinting. They wanted to weaponize memory. Ava leaned in. Weaponize. Imagine embedding a political prisoner's entire interrogation record into a canine scout. Or a defector's memory of classified maps, locations, access codes carried in a creature no one suspects. Or worse, using the host to overwrite someone else's mind. He reached back into the folder, pulled out a second image, a diagram of 2 brain scans side by side. One labeled STRDA10, the other Zeke P3. Lines connected them. Neural resonance points. Overlap percentages. They didn't just store Aiden and Zeke. They merged them. A symbiotic graft. And Aiden Ava's voice cracked. Jonas lowered his gaze. Something went wrong. He was the last subject. The transfer registered an 89% sync, the highest we'd seen. Then 3 days later, the lab exploded. Electrical failure, they said. But that wasn't true. He paused. I saw the security logs before they disappeared. Someone triggered a systems override, opened the cages, released the specimens. He nodded toward Zeke. He ran. Aiden vanished. Ava felt her heart slow, like the air had thickened. You think he's still in there? I don't think, Jonas said, meeting her eyes. I know. You've seen it. You've felt it. Eli stood. He dreams of the fire. Over and over. But he doesn't know if he started it, or if someone else did. Zeke looked up, whined softly. Jonas stared at the boy. My God, he whispered. You're linked. Ava turned toward him. Why, my son? Why would Zeke Aiden bond with him? Jonas stood, paced. It's resonance. A frequency. EchoMind didn't just replicate memories, it broadcasted them. A signal. Subconscious embedded in behavior and dreams. Most people wouldn't be sensitive to it. But a few children especially might receive fragments. He pointed at Eli. He's tuned in. Eli took a slow step toward the doctor. Zeke's scared. Jonas froze. He said that, no, but I feel it. Like heat, like panic in your chest. Zeke pressed against Eli's side, now protective, shaking slightly. He thinks they're coming, Eli whispered. Jonas returned to the table. They always come. Ava ran a hand through her hair. So what now? We keep running. He's a walking target. My son's a receiver. What do we do with that? Jonas stared into his mug. We finish what they started. Ava blinked. What? EchoMind was supposed to evolve. Not just store memory, but retrieve it. Separate it. Restore it. If Zeke carries the imprint of Aiden and your son can interface, then there's a chance we can pull Aiden out. Bring his consciousness into full clarity. Disentangle him from the confusion. Restore his self. Ava shook her head slowly. That sounds insane. It is insane, but it's the only shot we have. Then what, she asked. Jonas looked up, dead serious. Then we tell the world what they did. Zeke let out a long, low growl. Jonas turned to him. You remember, don't you? He asked. You remember all of it. Zeke's tail thumped once. A single beat. Then Eli whispered, he's ready. Jonas stood spine straighter now. Then we begin tonight. But in the back of the cabin, just past the range of flickering light, something beeped. Soft. Almost inaudible. No one noticed. But Zeke did. And somewhere miles away, an encrypted GPS signal had just gone live. The kitchen table had become a battlefield of memory. Sheets of paper, most half-used, were scattered across the wood grain like discarded thoughts. Crayon marks zigzagged in every direction, but only one sheet sat at the center. It was Eli's, drawn in shades of red and green and black, shaky but unmistakably detailed. A crude top-down map of something no 6-year-old should have ever seen: a research compound, segmented corridors, a square marked white room. And just beneath the far corner, a narrow looping line labeled in a child's scrawl, tunnel. Ava hovered behind him, equal parts shaken and mesmerized. Jonas leaned forward, tracing the path with a fingertip. This was classified architecture. No aerial shots. No site plans ever released. I didn't see it, Eli whispered. I remembered it. From across the room, Zeke sat upright, watching, waiting. Ava broke the silence. Can you take us there? Eli didn't answer with words. He looked at Zeke. The dog stood, walked to the door, and paused, looking back. They followed. The drive south took most of the night. Jonas had stocked a duffel with flashlights, an external drive, a radiation tag monitor, and a battered handheld Geiger counter. He didn't explain why. Ava didn't ask. By dawn, the snow had thinned into a barren, muddy stretch of road lined with old fencing and skeletal trees. There used to be a perimeter here, Jonas said. Security cameras, heat sensors, mines. Eli pointed through the windshield. There, a gate. Rusted shut, sign fallen. Behind it, the cracked concrete path of what once was a heavily guarded access road. Zeke jumped from the SUV, first nose twitching. He moved forward without hesitation. They passed the husk of a guard booth, its glass long shattered, a collapsed antenna beside it. Up ahead, the remains of the EchoMind facility loomed, charred, silent, and half buried in ice and soil. Nature had tried to reclaim it, but something about the place still pushed back. Jonas walked with his shoulders hunched, as if the ghosts of the building might claw him back. Fire started in the south wing, he muttered. Mainframe melted. They blamed faulty wiring. Ava stared at the blackened structure. But it wasn't an accident. No, Jonas said. It was him. Or part of him. Eli said nothing. He turned right away from the crumbled entrance, toward the base of an old maple that leaned against a stone outcropping. Zeke followed. There, nestled beneath the roots, was a slab of metal, circular, the size of a manhole, nearly obscured by decades of leaves and snow. Jonas exhaled slowly. Emergency maintenance shaft. Zeke sniffed once, then clawed at the edge. Eli dropped to his knees and helped fingers raw and cold. The metal gave way with a groan. Below, darkness. A ladder, the smell of copper and ash. Jonas clicked on the flashlight and climbed down first. Eli followed Zeke directly behind him, tail rigid. Ava hesitated, then descended into the dark. The tunnel stretched forever. Low ceilings, wires dangling like spider legs. Faint marks of flame still crawled along the walls, soot etched into tile. They passed broken emergency lights and long dead monitors, shattered glass, and rusted fire doors. At the end of the corridor, they found a hatch. Jonas hesitated. Beyond this was the sub-level memory lab. He pressed the access panel. Nothing happened. Power dead. Zeke stepped forward. His paw hit the edge of the panel. Lights sparked. Once. Twice. Then the hatch clicked. The door opened. The room beyond was intact mostly. Bank after bank of computer towers stood against the walls, dormant cables trailing across the floor like veins. At the far end, an operating table. Restraints still in place. Jonas's voice cracked. This is where we map the consciousness. Eli moved first, straight to a sealed cabinet near the corner. He didn't touch it, just stared. Behind here, he whispered. Zeke pawed the base of the cabinet, a hollow thump. Jonas knelt and pried it open. Behind the false wall, a steel box, locked. He forced it open with a screwdriver from his belt. Inside, a series of labeled hard drives, all marked with barcodes and serial numbers. One read Aiden started PU3 primary. Jonas stared. They kept it, even after the fire. He pulled out the drive and plugged it into the small portable reader he'd brought. The screen flared to life. And then images. Not video, not audio. Neural scans. Color-coded MRIs. Layers of mapped memory bursts. Brain activity simulations. One in particular showed two models side by side. One labeled Aiden, the other Zeke. At first, the scans looked different. But as the animation looped, the scans began to converge. Jonas paled. They overrode him. Ava leaned in. What do you mean? Not a storage. Not a copy. Aiden's neural pattern wasn't just uploaded, it was embedded. His memories were used to rewrite Zeke's fundamental behavior matrix. They didn't preserve the boy. They fed him to the dog. Eli whispered, That's why Zeke hurts. He's carrying a life that doesn't belong to him. Zeke lay down now, panting quietly, tail twitching. Jonas pulled up the memory signature scan. Look at this. The emotional peaks, fear, love, betrayal, they're all here. Trapped, looping. Ava swallowed hard. So can we get them out? I don't know, Jonas said. But there's something else. He pulled another scan, a heat map of the brainstem. This is Zeke's base pattern. his native cognition. He overlaid it with Aiden's and saw it. The conflict. Parts of the map glowed bright red, signs of rejection, confusion, crossfire. Jonas sat back. "He's dying," he whispered. "What?" "Not physically. Neurologically. The overlap is unsustainable. Two consciousnesses can't occupy the same architecture forever. One has to dominate or both degrade." Ava stared at Zeke. He looked back. And she knew. He knew too. Eli hugged him tight. Zeke pressed his head into the boy's chest. Jonas looked up slowly. "We have to extract what we can before it's lost. Before he is lost." Ava asked the only question that mattered. "How?" And from the dark, Zeke stood, walked to the center of the room, and barked once. Sharp. Direct. Eli stood beside him. "He's ready." And then the lights flickered. Motion sensors. No. Something else was awake. Somewhere behind the tree line, a raven took flight. A split second later, the world split open. The blast wasn't loud. It was silent. The kind of sound that burns into the body before it ever reaches the ears. A low-frequency pop followed by the sudden hum of energy, not natural. Zeke snapped to his feet, fur bristling. Eli jolted upright, eyes wide with something deeper than fear recognition. Ava felt it in her chest, an old instinct she hadn't used in years. "We have to move," Jonas said. "Now." "What was that?" Ava hissed. Jonas didn't answer. He was already moving. Zeke barked once, urgent, sharp. Then the lights in the lab died. Pitch black. Only the soft green glow from the portable scanner remained, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then a second sound. A crackle. Radio static close. A voice modulated and low bled through confirmed signal lock. "EchoMind relic is active. All teams converge on sub-level exit." Ava froze. Jonas's face turned white. "The Special Neural Division. Black Badge Unit. I didn't think they still existed." Zeke growled low and deliberate. He turned, nudged Eli with his snout. Eli didn't resist. He understood. They moved fast through the tunnel, retracing their steps, Jonas barely keeping pace. From behind came the thud of boots. Not running. Stalking. Coordinated. Synchronized. Trained. Outside, the forest had changed. Snow had returned, this time in waves. Visibility was no more than 10 feet. The wind clawed at their jackets. "Cut right," Ava shouted, voice nearly lost to the storm. Zeke led, nose close to the ground, sensing direction, even as nature turned into a white labyrinth. Behind them, two flashes lit the trees, thermal pulses. Scouting flares. "They're tracking Zeke," Jonas shouted. "He's broadcasting again." Eli grabbed Ava's hand tightly. "He's trying to shield us. But they're still hearing the echoes." Crack! Something snapped above. Zeke dove forward. Just as the air shimmered, an invisible net arced down from the trees, buzzing violently. Zeke slammed into Eli, knocking him free just in time. The trap sparked against the frozen ground, carving a black scorch into the snow. Ava screamed Zeke. He rolled twice, skidding on his side, then collapsed, a sharp cry tearing from his throat. Eli scrambled to him, hands trembling. Zeke, get up." Zeke twitched, trying to rise one leg, dragging unnaturally. Jonas yanked the net's housing unit from the tree and tossed it into the ravine. "They're deploying neural snares," he growled. "Non-lethal, meant to disrupt bioelectric resonance, to isolate him." Ava knelt beside Zeke, her fingers finding the burn along his side. He licked Eli's face. Still conscious. Still him. Eli leaned in close. Snow clung to his eyelashes. "I know I'm not Aiden," he whispered. "But I feel him, Zeke. I feel the pieces they took." Zeke stared into his eyes, something ancient in that gaze. Then he stood, shaky, but standing. Behind them, the sound of mechanical limbs hit the snow. Drones, 2 of them, black-bodied, spider-like, each with a central blinking eye and twin cannons humming with restrained energy. Jonas shoved a flare from his belt into Ava's hand. "On my signal, throw left, then run right." She didn't ask questions. He counted to 3. She threw. The flare burst in a blinding crimson arc. Zeke bolted first. Eli followed. Ava and Jonas last. The drone's sensors momentarily jammed, just enough. They made it into the thicker brush branches, slashing skin roots, grabbing at ankles. The forest devoured them, but the sound of the chase didn't stop. Not for a second. 30 minutes later, they stopped inside the hollowed base of a fallen pine. Zeke collapsed again, panting. Eli knelt beside him, gently pressing his forehead to the dog's. "He's hurting," he murmured. "But he says we have to keep going." Jonas checked the GPS. "They're fanning out. The blackout radius is collapsing. We'll lose our window in less than 20 minutes. Ava knelt beside Eli. "How are you?" He didn't answer right away. Then Zeke's not afraid of them. He's afraid of being forgotten. Of Aiden disappearing inside him forever. Ava touched his cheek. "We're going to fix it." He looked her in the eye. "Even if it means losing him." She couldn't answer. Not yet. Far above them, the lead agent from the Neural Division crouched beside the discarded net. "Burn pattern confirmed," she said into her comm. "EchoMind relic is injured. Switching to containment directive." A second voice crackled back. Authorization Sigma 13 confirmed. No witnesses. She stood black armor catching what little moonlight filtered through the storm, then gave the command, "Hunt." The forest narrowed. Every branch felt like a claw, every step a betrayal of sound. Zeke limped beside Eli, but he didn't slow. His nose was still pointed, driven, determined. Jonas fell back beside Ava. There's an old observation cabin about a mile out. It was off-grid even before the fire. If we can reach it, I might be able to set up the extraction relay. Extraction for what, Ava hissed. To isolate Aiden's memory matrix. Maybe even split it from Zeke's cognitive layer. I don't know if it'll work. But if we wait until they find us, we won't get a second chance. Ava looked ahead. Eli was talking to Zeke again, whispering through the wind. A child and a dog. But not just a child, not just a dog. They were becoming something else. Something neither science nor memory could fully contain. They reached the clearing, and then the spotlight hit them. Straight from the sky. A drone. Eli screamed. Zeke leapt one final desperate arc and took the drone out mid-air, fangs digging into metal. The machine exploded in a burst of sparks. Zeke fell hard, didn't move. Ava cried out. Eli was already beside him, hands on his chest, tears frozen on his cheeks. Zeke, please, please don't go. A slow breath. Zeke opened one eye. He licked Eli's hand. Alive. Barely, but alive. Jonas pulled Ava aside. Voice grave. This can't go on. We have to get what's inside him out. Now. She nodded. Somewhere in the woods, the black badge agents were closing in. But in this moment, there was only one truth. The boy was not alone, and the dog wounded, hunted, unforgettable, was more than memory. He was soul. The storm outside had become a distant roar muffled by layers of timber and time. Inside the abandoned observation cabin, everything smelled of old dust and forgotten wood smoke. The floorboards creaked under the weight of secrets. Zeke lay near the fireplace, wrapped in Ava's old parka, his breath shallow but steady. One eye remained half open, watchful. Eli never left his side. Jonas crouched over the old military laptop wires, snaking out from the portable drive they'd salvaged from the underground lab. The screen flickered, bathed in green code and faded government insignias. Encryption protocols are still active? Jonas muttered, fingers dancing across the keyboard. I need a biometric key. And a voice ID. It's voice-locked. It's... Ava's heart sank. A voice print, not just any voice. This encryption requires the originating neural host. Whoever Aiden was, he was the key. The room went still. Eli sat up. I heard him. Jonas turned. Went in my dreams. He kept saying something. What did he say? Eli closed his eyes, concentrated. Then softly, almost like he was slipping into a trance. The silence is not the end. I am still here. The laptop beeped. Jonas's eyes widened. That's it. That's the trigger phrase. It's validating. Lines of code unraveled on the screen. Layers of black protocol peeled away, exposing fragments of buried files. And then a window opened. Jonas clicked play. A video began. Grainy, distorted, but real. Inside a white windowless room, a boy, no older than Eli, sat strapped to a chair. Wires clung to his temples. His eyes stared straight ahead. A voice from off-screen. Begin phase 3. Initiate memory detachment. The boy flinched, screamed. His voice echoed off the cabin walls. Ava turned away. Eli didn't. Zeke didn't either. The file jumped forward. New footage. Another child, then another. All different ages, backgrounds. Boys and girls, all inside that same cold white room, all being cleansed. Jonas's voice was low, almost breaking. They weren't saving memories. They were deleting them, replacing them. These kids were being harvested. Ava's hands shook. How many? He tapped through file trees. Thousands of lines, codes, tag numbers, and then a directory named Neural Candidates, Project Chimera. He opened it. Photos loaded, names, ages, places of origin. Dozens, then hundreds. Jonas leaned closer. Some of these kids were never reported missing. They were ghosts before they were even taken. Eli pointed to the screen. Her. I've seen her. In one of my dreams. Ava whispered, she's real. Jonas nodded. They all are. A sudden realization sank in. This wasn't just science. It was a cover operation. Military, Ava asked. Jonas hesitated. Worse. Corporate military hybrid. Contracted by private firms and protected by defense clearance. This isn't just illegal, it's institutionalized. He clicked another file. This one contained emails, redacted headers. But the content was clear. Subject D347 responded to exposure stimuli. Recommend extraction at age 6. Implantation scheduled within 48 hours. We must ensure no traceable emotional pattern remains. Wipe familial recall completely. Ava stared in disbelief. They erased their families. Jonas clicked one last file. The most encrypted. He ran a patch and unlocked it. A list loaded. Authorized personnel. level theta access. A series of names, full names, birth dates, clearances. Some were scientists, some were generals. One was a senator. Ava's jaw clenched. They built an entire world on the backs of these kids, Eli whispered. But Zeke didn't forget. He kept them. Jonas turned. Yes, against all odds, against neural rejection, he preserved fragments of each. And through you, Eli, they're waking up. Eli swallowed. So now what do we do? Ava stepped forward. Her eyes weren't afraid anymore. We show the world. Jonas started the upload. Satellite tethering was weak in the storm, but the cabin's solar backup barely held. The files began to push through photos, footage documents. Then progress froze. Jonas cursed. They're jamming the uplink. Someone knows we're transmitting. Ava stared at the signal strength bar as it flickered red, and then a crackle from the radio beside the laptop. You've gone too far. Shut it down. Jonas snatched the mic. Too late. It's already out there. Not yet. You have one chance. Leave the dog. Leave the data. Walk away. Ava grabbed the radio. Her voice didn't tremble. We don't walk away. You don't get to bury children twice. The radio went silent. Eli spoke softly. They're coming again, aren't they? Jonas nodded. Zeke stirred, growled. But Ava didn't flinch. Then let them come, she said. We have everything we need. Jonas stared at her. Even if they shut us down, someone saw. Someone downloaded. We triggered a breach that'll ripple across systems they thought were buried. He looked at Eli. You cracked it. Not because of access, but because of connection. Eli nodded. I didn't know Aiden, but I feel what he felt. And I'll never let him be erased. Ava placed a hand on his back. And we'll make sure no child ever is again. The laptop beeped. Upload 98%. Jonas's eyes widened. Just a little longer. And then the cabin lights died. Ava reached for the flare gun. Jonas raised the backup radio. Outside, footsteps crunched the snow. But inside, memory was alive. And it was finally speaking. Zeke stood in the doorway, chest rising and falling in jagged breaths, his fur matted with blood and snow. The look in his eyes had changed. Something inside him was splintering, his pupils, dilated movements, twitchy, erratic. Ava had seen trauma before. She'd treated soldiers with fractured psyches, patients haunted by invisible wounds. But this was different. Zeke wasn't remembering pain. He was reliving it. Behind her, Jonas shouted over the static of the failing satellite uplink. Signal's up, but it won't hold if you're going to do it. Do it now. Ava didn't hesitate. She dropped in front of the lens, her hands shaking only slightly, as she keyed in the live broadcast stream. She looked straight into the camera. My name is Ava Miller. I'm a licensed trauma therapist, and what you're about to see is real. These are classified files documenting the illegal experimentation on children through a covert neural weaponization program. She clicked the first file. Footage of Aiden played the boy strapped to a chair screaming as a machine extracted his memories. This was done without consent, without oversight. And the proof lives in the body of a dog named Zeke, who is no longer just a dog. She uploaded the neural scans. The project was called EchoMind. The goals store human consciousness in living vessels for use in espionage, psychological warfare, and memory suppression. Behind her, Zeke let out a low, guttural growl. Zeke holds the key, Ava continued. Not just to the past, but to the crimes committed against these children. Jonas gave her a thumbs up. The stream's stable, he whispered. We're live on global humanitarian networks, UN subgroups, NGOs, even the Intercontinental Ethics Tribunal. Ava turned back to the camera. They want him back to erase him. But if you're watching this, please understand, he is not property. He is not technology. He is memory. He is witness. And you need to know what they've done. Zeke began to pace. His head jerked left, then right, muscles spasming along his flank. Eli reached for him. Zeke. The dog recoiled, eyes wide, unfocused. He let out a sound that was not a bark, not a growl. Something confused, distorted. Then without warning, he lunged at the wall. Claws tearing at wood teeth bared, biting empty air. Ava flinched. Zeke. Jonas grabbed a tranquilizer, but Eli blocked him. No, he's scared, not dangerous. Zeke spun in a circle body, collapsing into instinct and memory. From the radio still plugged into the uplink, a voice crackled. We are inbound. Retrieval in T-6 minutes. Subject must be neutralized if unstable. Jonas cursed. They're coming, and if Zeke's compromised, they'll use it as justification to kill him. Eli stepped closer to Zeke. It's okay, he whispered. I hear it too. All the voices, all the pieces. You're not alone in it. Zeke trembled. Then his entire body snapped. He rammed into the wall, barking wildly, knocking over the comms rig. Sparks burst. Jonas shouted. Ava shielded her face. Eli didn't move. He crouched in front of Zeke, face to face. Listen to me, he said, calm and steady. You're not just him. You're you. Zeke's head tilted. The storm in his eyes slowed. Remember when you saved me from the net? Eli whispered. Remember the cabin, the snow, my hand on your heart? Zeke blinked. Breath by breath, the chaos subsided. He lowered his head into Eli's lap. The room went silent again. Jonas exhaled, but the reprieve didn't last. From outside, tires crunched ice. Lights swept through the cabin's broken shutters. Ava turned back to the satellite feed. The transmission stream was peaking. She switched the camera to Zeke. This is the vessel you built to erase lives, she said, voice hard now. But he didn't forget. And neither will we. She leaned forward. Zeke is no longer your project. He is a witness, and you cannot silence him again. Outside, a black ops team disembarked from a matte gray truck with no plates, no insignias, faces hidden behind thermal masks. The leader gave a silent signal. They approached the cabin, weapons raised, not in defense, in elimination protocol. Inside, Ava stared at the screen. Upload 99.3%. The progress bar pulsed. Just a little longer, Jonas murmured. Eli sat with Zeke's arms around his neck. Zeke was still shaking, but he wasn't fighting anymore. He was remembering, and somehow letting go. Ava turned back to Jonas. How much time do we have? He glanced at the scanner. 60 seconds, maybe less. Suddenly, crash! The back door blew inward. Gas canisters rolled in. Down, Ava screamed, pulling Eli to the floor. Zeke rose this time, not panicked. He stood between the gas and the boy tail, still head raised like a sentinel. 3 agents stormed in. One aimed a taser. Zeke didn't flinch. He took the shot voltage tearing through his side, but he stayed up. Another agent raised a real weapon. Ava screamed, "No!" Jonas hurled the comms unit, crushing the agent's mask. The room erupted into chaos. A fistfight, a standoff. Eli dragged Zeke behind an overturned table. Then another beep. Jonas's laptop blinked. Upload complete. Global confirmation pinged. The truth was out. Ava grabbed the flare gun, fired it into the ceiling. The whole room lit up in fire-orange rage. Through the haze, the lead agent paused, mask cracked. He saw Zeke, bloody and gasping, lying protectively over the child. And in that moment, he didn't shoot. He backed out, silently, then vanished into the storm. 10 minutes later, the cabin was quiet again. Jonas wrapped Zeke's wounds. Eli whispered stories to him. Stories of mountains and lakes and summers without labs. Ava finished the final report, signing her name digitally at the bottom of the testimony. She looked out the broken window. The world wouldn't go back to the way it was. But at least now, it knew. And Zeke was still breathing, still remembering, still alive. The sun was barely cresting the horizon, casting long streaks of red and gold over the battered landscape of the forest clearing. Smoke still curled from the charred remains of the uplink cabin. Frost clung to tree branches, glistening like glass above the silent snow. Ava stood in the middle of it all, her coat blood-stained and half-torn. Jonas was hunched over the remains of their equipment, trying to salvage whatever he could. Zeke was curled beside Eli, breathing hard, but alive. But there was no peace. Not yet. The low hum of rotors sliced through the cold morning air. Jonas looked up. They're back. This time they weren't hiding. A black tilt-rotor aircraft descended into the clearing, its markings obscured. Dozens of armed operatives in tactical gear disembarked with synchronized precision, forming a wide semicircle around Ava, Eli, and Zeke. The lead stepped forward. Maskless, cold, calculating. Director Markham, the man who had greenlit Project EchoMind. Dr. Miller, he said, his voice even. Stand down. That animal is property of the U.S. Neurotech Division. You've committed multiple federal crimes, including possession of classified assets and unlawful dissemination of government intelligence. Ava didn't move. You tortured children, she replied. You rewired their minds like machines. That's not science. That's genocide. Markham's expression didn't shift. The courts can decide that. For now, we take back the subject. 2 agents moved forward. Eli stood up. His voice shook, but his feet didn't. You can't have him. Markham glanced at the boy. Son, you don't understand what you're protecting. I do, Eli said. Zeke isn't a project. He's not just a container. He's my friend. He's my brother. He's the reason I remember Aiden's pain. Markham stepped forward, his tone lowering. He's a liability. You want to protect him? Fine. But when he loses control again, when the fractures in his memory make him attack, who do you think he'll hurt first? Zeke raised his head, growled. Eli didn't move. He already hurt for us, for all of them. He remembered what you tried to bury. Then from behind the agents, a sharp voice cut through the static. No, Markham. The world remembers now, too. All heads turned. A figure stepped out from the shadows. Mid-20s. Hoodie pulled over his head, a satchel over his shoulder, eyes burning with clarity. It was a face Ava had seen in the files. Kieran West, age 9. Vanished without a trace. Last seen outside a foster center in Phoenix. A neural candidate. Now he was here, alive, holding a laptop and a signal booster. I patched into the UN feed, Kieran said. Every human rights network on the planet has your footage, your files, your voice, Markham. He held up a flash drive. You left your signature in the neural sequence code. Sloppy. Markham's jaw tightened. You're a ghost, he muttered. You were terminated. No, Kieran replied. I escaped. With fragments. Of faces. Of names. I spent years rebuilding myself from scraps you failed to delete. He walked forward, standing beside Ava. I couldn't save the others. But I can save this one. He pointed to Zeke. You turned a dog into a vault. But he became more than you ever expected. He evolved. Markham's radio crackled. A voice barked orders. Urgent. Panicked. Global leak confirmed. Subcommittees alert. Senate inquiry initiated. Tribunal request processed. Markham's composure fractured. He turned to his men. Retrieve the subject. Lethal force authorized if. No, Eli screamed. The soldiers moved. And then Zeke moved faster. He surged forward with a roar that was not animal, but ancient, as if thousands of fragmented voices howled through him. He lunged at the front line, took down the first soldier before a trigger could be pulled. Shots rang out. Ava dove in front of Eli. Jonas fired the last flare toward the ground, igniting a smoke screen. In the chaos, Kieran triggered a signal jammer, disrupting comms across the clearing. Zeke, despite his injuries, fought with terrifying precision. He didn't kill, but he incapacitated. Bite to the arm, knock to the head. His actions were surgical, like a memory executing a plan. And then he stopped, stood over Eli, chest heaving, bloody, trembling, but alive. The last soldier froze, gun shaking. He lowered it. A ripple went through the formation. Markham stared in disbelief. You don't understand, he hissed. He's not yours to save. He's too far gone. He can't be whole. Ava stepped forward. No, but we can be. She turned to Zeke, and so did the cameras still streaming. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a reckoning, and the world was watching. Markham tried one last move, pulled a sidearm, but Zeke was faster. He leapt, not to kill, just enough force to knock the weapon away. Then he stood on Markham's chest, growling, unblinking, every ounce of intelligence in his eyes. Eli stepped beside him. Say it, he whispered. Tell the world what you did. Markham didn't, but it didn't matter. The truth already had a voice, and that voice was a child, a dog, a memory that refused to die. Snow fell gently as if the storm had spent itself, and now only the softest whispers of winter remained. The trees stood silent, the scars of battle hidden beneath fresh powder. The sky was clear now, pale blue stretching endlessly overhead, like breath finally released after holding in too much for too long. News trucks had come and gone. Global broadcasts looped the footage of Ava's live stream on major outlets. Tribunals had begun. Whistleblowers stepped forward. An official congressional inquiry into Project EchoMind had launched within 48 hours of Ava's leak. And amid it all, Zeke had survived. But more than survived, he was seen. 3 weeks later, in a quiet courtroom tucked away in northern Colorado, a judge sat solemnly behind his bench. I've reviewed the evidence, he said, glancing at the assembled experts, scientists, neurologists, military advisors, ethicists. This is unprecedented. But then so was what was done to him. Zeke sat beside Eli in the gallery, a custom-made vest over his chest. His eyes scanned the room calmly, not as an animal, but as someone aware. I hereby recognize the sentient capacity of the canine, known as Zeke, the judge declared. This court acknowledges him as a non-human individual with independent cognition. He shall not be classified as property, but as a living being with legal protections under the Ethical Recognition of Advanced Intelligence Act. There was a pause, no applause, no celebration. Just stillness. A weight lifted. Eli gripped Zeke's paw, his smile quiet and warm. 6 months passed. The small town of Larkwood, nestled beneath Montana's quiet hills, had changed. Once a forgotten blip on a snow-covered map. Now it was known for something else. The Haven Center, a refuge not just for animals, but for healing souls. A converted barn now bore sunlit windows. Cozy, reading corners, quiet rooms with blankets and soft music. But more importantly, it held the one thing most children there had been denied: safety. Children who had survived abduction, neglect, trauma, war. They came in small trembling steps, often silent, sometimes furious. But Zeke didn't ask questions. He only sat by the door, waited until they came to him. And when they did, he listened. He didn't bark. He understood. One girl, age 9, hadn't spoken since her parents vanished. She sat in the corner every day, drawing swirls on the carpet. Zeke lay beside her, unmoving. One day, without prompting, she whispered, "Can he stay in my dream tonight?" Another child, a refugee boy who flinched at every noise, curled up next to Zeke one morning and fell asleep for the first time in weeks. And for each of them, Zeke was not just a dog. He was proof that pain didn't have to be the end of the story. Eli ran the place with quiet confidence. Though only 7 now, he carried himself like someone older, not hardened, but aware. He'd seen too much, but he'd also survived it, and he'd helped others do the same. On the walls hung drawings, Eli riding on Zeke's back. Aiden's name surrounded by stars, a sketch of Ava hugging both of them. Ava now taught art therapy on weekends. She had turned her trauma into purpose-blending clinical knowledge with a kind of fierce maternal wisdom. One afternoon, as golden light poured through the windows, Ava sat on the steps with a cup of tea. She watched Eli gently place a weighted blanket over a trembling boy who had just arrived from a foster shelter. Zeke lay nearby, head resting on his paws. His fur grayed slightly at the muzzle now. He no longer paced in his sleep, no longer growled in confusion. He was at peace. Does he ever remember? Ava asked softly, watching Zeke. Eli sat down beside her, legs swinging. Sometimes, he said, but it's like a radio station fading in and out. He catches pieces, then lets them go. Ava nodded. And what's about you? Do you still see Aiden? Eli paused. Not the way I used to, but I feel him sometimes. When I close my eyes at night, he's not afraid anymore. There was silence between them. Not heavy, but full. Like a song with no words, just harmony. That night the stars came out early. Eli curled up on the rug, Zeke beside him, breathing slow and deep. Ava sat nearby, reading by the fire. Suddenly Zeke stirred, not in fear, but as if called. He rose, padded quietly out the back door and into the open yard. Eli followed without a word, barefoot in the grass. They stood together under the moon. The sky above was velvet black, studded with a million distant promises. Zeke sat, looked up, and then something in his eyes changed. Eli placed a hand on his neck. What do you see? Zeke didn't answer with sound, but Eli closed his eyes, and he saw it too. A field bathed in warm sunlight. Laughter. A child running barefoot through tall grass. Aiden. Aiden turned to look at Zeke, not scared, just smiling. You kept it? The boy's voice said softly. You kept me alive. Zeke blinked. Then, the image faded, like mist lifting off a lake at dawn. Eli opened his eyes again. Zeke's chest rose and fell. One breath, then another, and peace settled. Later that week, they added a new plaque outside the center. It read, "For those whose memories were taken, and those who remembered for them." Below it, 2 paw prints were etched into the wood. One small, one strong. Eli stood beside the carving, his hand resting on Zeke's head. Ava joined them, wrapped her arms around them both. In that moment, they weren't survivors. They were a family. And the world, for all its horrors, had allowed them one sacred truth. That healing, no matter how long it takes, is possible. And sometimes the ones who save us walk on 4 legs, with ancient memories in their eyes and unbreakable loyalty in their hearts.